Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this fourth event of our exploration of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. We're coming to you from Casa, Esther Catholic Worker House in Ann Arbor, Wisconsin, that was founded in 2010 by Father Joseph Matern. We have been exploring what nonviolence is, its effectiveness, its significance as a spirituality and a lifestyle. Tonight and next week, we will be exploring the practical applications of nonviolence in our world and in our church. But first, I'm really honored and pleased and happy to welcome Archbishop John C. Wester of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we're going to put into the chat, he wrote and published, and it came out in early January of this year, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, as a pastoral letter, a conversation toward nuclear disarmament. Archbishop Wester really stepped out and started a great dialogue concerning nuclear disarmament. And so, Archbishop Wester, I welcome you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you all tonight. And I certainly affirm all that you're doing to promote peace and nonviolence in our world, which is getting ever more scary and tense, as we all know. I've been asked to give a little opening prayer, which I'm happy to do. And of course, the whole point of the pastoral letter was to sustain a conversation regarding nuclear disarmament, but more broadly, to continue to promote the gospel of nonviolence. I think quite often we tend over the years to water down the gospel's message of nonviolence. We come up with reasons why we can do this or that, but I think it's really important to listen carefully to Christ's command to live in peace. On the night before he died, he said, peace is my farewell to you. So this is really a critical and important and core element of the gospel, what you're all about. My own pastoral, David, was begun when a trip I took about 5 years ago with two brother bishops to Japan, and we went to, of course, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And it was a profound experience for all of us and for anyone who goes there. And then being the Archbishop of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the Manhattan Project began the first and created the first nuclear bomb that was used in war, I felt it was imperative that we continue this dialogue here from Santa Fe on nuclear disarmament. So I want to thank you all for what you're doing and encourage you and let you know you're all in my prayers. And I'm especially pleased to see the students who are involved in this. It's really important for our students, for our young people, our youth, to really carry this banner of peace and nonviolence, and particularly nuclear disarmament. So as we begin, then I'll just call to mind God's presence with us. When two or three are gathered together in his name, he's with us. And I'll just offer this prayer on behalf of all of us. We come into your holy presence this evening, loving God, as we seek the gift of peace, a peace the world cannot give and cannot achieve without you. Your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, gave us this gift the night before he died. Peace is my farewell to you, and peace is my gift to you. May we receive this gift in our hearts always, so that we might truly become instruments of your peace in our broken and fragile world. Loving God, your servant Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that peace can only be achieved if we open ourselves to your agape love. He held the deep conviction that only with this love, radiating from the heart of the Trinity, can we have the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation, to suffer without the desire for retaliation, and to reconcile without the desire for domination. We pray tonight that your love for us and for your creation will inspire all of humanity to serve, to suffer, and to reconcile, all in the name of peace. Give us the grace to end all wars, especially in Ukraine, to end violence, especially in Haiti, and to end the divisions that pit us one against the other. May we rejoice that we are all children of God, sisters and brothers all, and may we one day come together as one human family, giving you honor, praise, and glory. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord.
Amen. Thank you, Archbishop Wester. I'd like to encourage everybody in the chat, if you go to that link, it'll take you to the website of the Santa Fe Archdiocese, and there you can download a one-page summary of the pastoral letter, or you can download, or you can do both, download the entire pastoral letter. It's something you really should do. It's very worthwhile. The one-page summary you can pass on to your contacts and spread the word. So again, thank you, Archbishop Wester, for praying for us tonight and opening this session. Tonight's moderator is Justin Novotney. He is a husband, a father to 3 young boys, and his family is part of the Great Turning Catholic Worker Farm in Madison, Wisconsin. Justin has been exploring nonviolence and nonviolent direct action since 2016, becoming involved with groups like the Extinction Rebellion and the Fierce Vulnerability Network, a project of the East Point Peace Academy. Justin, welcome.
Hey, thanks, David. Appreciate you having me. Yeah, and it's my pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers tonight, Eli McCarthy and Sister Wamuyu Wachira. Eli McCarthy teaches at Georgetown University in the Justice and Peace Studies program. He was the editor of A Just Peace Ethic Primer, Building Sustainable Peace and Breaking Cycles of Violence, published in 2020. He serves on the steering committee of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and is the coordinator of the DC Peace Team. Earlier this year, Eli participated on an interfaith team in Ukraine in order to build solidarity and advance nonviolent peacemaking. Sister Wamuyu Wachira is a Kenyan citizen living and working in Nairobi, Kenya. She is a member of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, commonly known as the Loretto Sisters. Wamuyu is a senior lecturer in peace and conflict studies at St. Paul's University in Nairobi and is co-president of Pax Christi International. She is an ardent, committed peace scholar and peace builder, advocating for active nonviolence as a spirituality, a way of life, and an effective method of preventing and addressing violence at all levels. She trains religious sisters and youth in active nonviolence peace building. So welcome, Eli, welcome, Wamuyu, and I will pass it over to you, Eli.
All right. Thank you so much, Justin. It's wonderful to be with you all this evening. Thank you for joining us tonight and for those who have been here for some of the earlier sessions. So I'm going to start with a couple quotes, and one is from Sister Nazik Madi from Iraq. And she lived during the wars that have happened recently in Iraq. And she said, "War is the mother of ignorance, isolation, and poverty. I say this as a daughter of war. We can't respond to violence with worse violence. This encourages the spiral of violence up, and the people are so exhausted because they don't know what's happening. It's like a dragon with 7 heads. You cut one, and 2 others come up." A second quote, Dr. Denis Mukwege from the Democratic Republic of Congo. "As long as corruption, poverty, and the scourge of rape plagues families in our society, there will be no lasting nor meaningful peace. Let us not be mistaken. The behavior of men during conflicts reflects their behavior during peacetime, except that during wars, that violence that was sleeping in the family and the community is set free and explodes." So tonight's section of the Advancing Nonviolence and Just Peace book offers a new moral framework to better respond to the way of Jesus, the mission of the church, and the challenges of injustice and violence of our times. This part of the book includes sections on just governance, policing, and responsibility to protect. So the mission of the church is to draw people to a loving relationship with God by illuminating God's way in the person of Jesus and inviting the community to live in the presence of the Holy Spirit. This is our focus. This moral framework arises from and within a pastoral approach that listens to the experiences and voices of people in conflict situations across various cultural spaces. So as we heard last week about the theological and scriptural foundations for nonviolence, this moral framework is oriented by nonviolence and just peace. So here, nonviolence is understood as a positive reverence for dignity in life, as well as the constant effort to avoid dehumanization and participation in other types of violence, such as structural and cultural violence. And you'll see on the slide, there's a few other aspects: power of love, path to truth, spirituality, intersectional theme, strategic method, and so forth. This orientation envisions a just peace as a way of cooperation for the common good, care for our ecological home, the prevention of violence, and the transformation of conflict by nonviolent means. So in a just peace framework, there's three basic categories of action. One is virtues and skills to transform or engage conflict constructively. Two is breaking cycles of violence. And three is building more sustainable peace. And just peace norms operate across these three categories, and they may overlap in time and space, but they apply to all stages of conflict. And strategies and actions that are chosen must either enhance or at least not obstruct these norms, as well as keep means and ends consistent as much as possible. So this first category, virtues and skills to transform and engage conflict constructively. The first norm is sustaining spiritual disciplines. And these can be things like contemplation, discernment, prayer. The second one is virtuous habits, virtues such as mercy, compassion, courage, nonviolence. Third, learning nonviolent skills, education, and training. And things like nonviolent communication or civil resistance or social analysis of root causes, gender, racial, intersectional, needs-based types of analysis. 4, participatory processes. And 5, forming nonviolent peacemaking communities or institutions and cultures. The second category is breaking cycles of violence. So these norms include reflexivity, keeping the means consistent with the ends. Second, rehumanization through the kind of language that we use, the kind of narratives we focus on to describe others, the memories that we attend to. Third, conflict transformation, addressing root causes, using practices like trauma healing, independent initiatives to build trust, meeting human needs. The next one is nonviolent direct action. This includes civil resistance, unarmed civilian protection, nonviolent civilian-based defense. And 5, acknowledging responsibility for harm, such as restorative justice practices. And 6, integral disarmament is one of Pope Francis's terms, where he uses this to refer to the need for a preceding or simultaneous reduction of weapons or disarming of the heart, which will better then enable us to reduce concrete or physical weapons. And then the third category is building sustainable peace. So these include norms like relationality and reconciliation, practices such as interreligious dialogue, truth and reconciliation commissions. Second, robust civil society and just governance, such as redistributing political power and the practice of advocacy. Third, ecological sustainability and justice. So the long-term well-being of people, non-human animals, the environment, kind of integral ecology. Fourth, human dignity and human rights of all, including our adversaries. And lastly, economic, gender, and racial justice with a focus on the marginalized and the vulnerable. So these are the kind of three categories, and they focus us on these different norms. So our actions need to either be consistent with these norms, enhance them, or at least not obstruct them. So key questions become things like, what are the root causes of the conflict? What virtues or habits are at stake or skills are needed to engage conflict constructively? What practices could break the dynamic or the cycle of violence? What could actually build a sustainable just peace? So there's a book called The Just Peace Ethic Primer, and I'll send you a link to it in the chat box a little bit later, but it includes cases of drawing on a just peace framework for issues like immigration in the US, racial justice, environmental justice, the death penalty, but also cases like civil war in South Sudan, gang violence in El Salvador, rape as a weapon of war in Congo, ethnic violence in Kenya, women-led resistance in the Philippines, and ISIS in Iraq. So that's a little kind of summary of a just peace framework. And now I want to kind of unpack how this is distinct or contributions it makes in comparison to kind of a just war approach. So some of the advantages of a just peace framework is, number one, is that just peace can actually do a better job of helping us prevent war and even limiting war if it breaks out. Whereas the just war framework has mostly been used to justify rather than to prevent or limit war. Cardinal McElroy and Cardinal Turkson have both said that the just war ethic itself has, quote, become only a little bit less than a green light for war and increasingly ineffective at restraining war. The second advantage is that the just peace better breaks cycles of violence, whereas the just war consistently gets us stuck in dynamics or cycles of violence, even when a war appears to be just. For example, we saw this with World War II, leading to a cycle of violence with the Cold War, numerous proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan in the 80s, which led to the conditions and dynamic for 9/11, and then 20 more years of war in Afghanistan. Third, just peace has more of a focus and addresses the root causes and seeks to build sustainable peace. It's consistent with a conflict transformation approach, which means that it looks at the personal, relational, structural, and cultural dimensions of conflict. Whereas just war fails to really address these root causes of violence and build a sustainable peace. Another advantage is that a just peace approach addresses structural and cultural violence, which is often what contributes to direct violence or war. Whereas just war framework too often can actually enable structural and cultural violence, because if there's going to be a potential just war, then countries must get prepared for that war. And this includes an arms race and propaganda for militarization or for war, which becomes part of the cultural violence. The next one is that just peace forms us as courageous, nonviolent peacemakers, right? This is really what being a disciple is ultimately about. Who do we become? How can we become more courageous, nonviolent peacemakers? Just war doesn't really do that work that well in terms of forming us as courageous, nonviolent peacemakers. And then the last two, just peace is consistent with human dignity and ecological care, whereas just war is inconsistent with our dignity and care for the environment. In terms of dignity, war generates trauma. It lowers empathy. It fails to illuminate the sacred gift of all people. And then finally, just peace better enables us to get closer to possibly outlawing or ending war, whereas just war obstructs the goal to outlaw and end war. And this is a goal which Vatican II itself called us to strain every muscle to outlaw war. So these are some of the considerations when kind of reflecting on this, these different frameworks as we try to kind of move forward in the mission of the church. So I want to kind of shift now to an application of this in the case of the war in Ukraine with Russia, and just kind of map out a few different aspects in a very difficult situation, right? Very complex, and it's hard to kind of imagine how to move through this. So although just peace is relevant to many types of conflicts, one recent prominent conflict the just peace framework can help us analyze and respond to is the war in Ukraine, which is nothing short of a human and ecological catastrophe. In this conflict, we have failed to engage diplomacy that prioritizes the dignity and the human needs of key stakeholders. We have failed to adequately train people in nonviolent conflict, resistance, and civilian-based defense. This war has been going on since 2014, where political conflict led to the Maidan demonstrations that changed the Russian-leaning government leadership in Ukraine. And then the Russians annexed Crimea, which was part of Ukraine. And then there were Minsk agreements about a year later, which called for dialogue between the Ukrainian government and the separatists in the East to form to shape a form of political autonomy so that it would still remain part of Ukraine. But instead, there was a strong lean towards counterterrorism operations for about 7 years, steady escalation from both sides, and ultimately a failure to implement Minsk. Leadership from key areas in the Donbass region declared independence and signaled welcome to Russian intervention. With the escalation of the war this February, many in the international community responded with some laudable nonviolent actions, such as humanitarian resources, welcoming of refugees, diplomatic efforts, coalition building, consistent public statements, economic non-cooperation, solidarity demonstrations, and prayer. And some examples of courageous Ukrainian nonviolent action include them blocking convoys and tanks, standing their ground even when warning shots were fired in multiple towns. In other towns, people organized peace rallies and convinced the Russian military to get out of their town. Ukrainians have fraternized with Russian soldiers to lower their morale and stimulate defections. At the end of August, I joined a group from Romania called the Peace and Training Institute on a trip to Ukraine. We met with leading Ukrainian nonviolent activists and peace builders. We heard their stories of resistance as well as their needs for support and resources. Some stories included farmers refusing to sell grain to Russian soldiers, fire departments refusing to join the emergency structures of the Russians, Ukrainians helping to hide local administration officials, school directors, and other activists, alternative administrative centers, and engaging Russian civil society on the reality of war. A more recent report identified over 235 nonviolent actions by Ukrainians and the need for more support for local peace builders and activists to resist the occupation. They found that nonviolent resistance hindered some of the long-term military and political goals of the Russian authorities, such as the institutionalization of the military occupation and repression in occupied territories, that it has protected many civilians, that it's undermined the Russian narrative, built community resilience, and strengthened local governance. The Nonviolent Peace Force also has programming in Mykolaiv and Kharkiv in Ukraine. They're providing unarmed civilian protection, especially to elderly, disabled, and children. One of the conflict monitors we met with in Kharkiv, kind of northeast Ukraine, and resourced by the UN, said that in the occupied areas where nonviolent resistance was the primary method, those Ukrainians ended up facing less repression in response to that kind of resistance. Whereas in the areas where violent resistance was primary, those Ukrainians faced more repression in response to that kind of resistance. So nevertheless, the primary strategy by the US and the UK is to support Ukraine with militarization, which is really only a continuation of the efforts since about 2015. So now today we have over 8 million internally displaced persons, 7 million refugees, over 6,000 civilians killed, and nearly 400 kids killed, and tens of thousands of soldiers killed. With a significant ramping up of militarization in Europe and untold ecological damage. This cannot be characterized as success, regardless of whoever may win the war. A just peace approach could offer some important contributions by shifting the focus. First of all, it aims to cultivate the virtues and skills to engage conflict constructively. So for example, before the large-scale violent conflict broke out in February, a just peace framework would challenge the common use of dehumanizing descriptions of adversaries, a use of language that tends to increase hostility and the likelihood of violence. But beyond language, a just peace approach also entails building the capacity for nonviolent peace building through widespread education and training, which demands developing an infrastructure that can sustain this work. It would include a focus on and holding accountable both parties to the Minsk agreements and a reevaluation of the armed counterterrorism approaches to the separatists in eastern Ukraine. Second, a just peace framework aims to break cycles of violence. So for example, with the focus on keeping means and ends consistent, this would include support and advocacy for those courageous nonviolent resistance, those using non-cooperation, nonviolent civilian defense in Ukraine, as well as in Russia. In addition, the focus on breaking the dynamics of violence would include an emphasis on dialogue and consistent diplomatic engagement at the political and social dimension. Third, this framework has a commitment to build a more sustainable peace. So this would include a focus on actions that best serve the well-being of the most marginalized and vulnerable, such as the elderly and the children, as well as ecological justice. So it would entail practices to generate a more robust civil society, a more just governance, such as reducing corruption, as well as commitment to reconciliation. This just peace framework seems consistent with what Pope Francis appears to be doing to kind of shift the world's gaze amid war in Ukraine. A shift modeled by Jesus toward the practice of accompaniment, with a focus on breaking the dynamic of violence. While it affirms and admires Ukrainians who are willing to take a high-risk stand against injustice rather than to be passive, it is also not about justifying methods of war or enabling any dynamics of violence to perpetuate and spread. Such accompaniment is being done in creative, courageous, nonviolent ways by Francis, as well as by Ukrainians and Russians and others. Among one of the things that I came to understand more deeply was that to break the dynamic of violence, conflicting parties should be engaged in a consistent, flexible, and needs-based dialogue. A mediated dialogue succeeded in July with agreements on grain shipments. Yet today, key political leaders are resisting broader negotiations. Many of them argue that negotiations are only valuable after there's a military advantage on the ground. Yet, in light of a just peace frame, this represents kind of succumbing to a distorted logic or a capitulation to the mentality, justifications, and dynamic of war. That is, such negotiations rarely, if ever, yield sustainable solutions because humanization, consideration of needs, and reconciliation are not prioritized. Further, it's often true that women are marginalized at best when dialogue and negotiation are based on something other than seeking the good of all parties to the conflict. So beyond dialogue, a just peace framework emphasizes mass nonviolent resistance strategies. In a groundbreaking book called Why Civil Resistance Works, researchers analyzed more than 300 contemporary conflicts and showed that nonviolent resistance is not only twice as effective as violent resistance, but also at least 10 times more likely to lead to durable democracy, including against authoritarians. This research included campaigns with objectives such as resisting occupation or seeking self-determination. These are both relevant aspects of the broader situation in the conflict in Ukraine. And there were also many cases in the research related to Soviet or communist dictators or regimes. The bottom line is that the more we lean on violent resistance or mass organized campaigns of violence associated with war, the more likely we are to cultivate habits that correspond to less durable democracies and more to authoritarian politics. Such habits include domination, distrust, bitterness, hatred, less empathy, more corruption, domestic violence, generational trauma, and militarization. By contrast, we might better lean into the work of supporting mass organized coalitions of nonviolent resistance and thus cultivate habits both in persons and societies that correspond to more durable democracies, human dignity, and thus human flourishing. Such habits include broader participation in politics and society, consensus making, coalition building, engaging conflict constructively, empathy, humanization, creativity, and compassion. To move in this direction, it would seem to help to emphasize the right to life and the human need for safety, both of which can open up more creative ways of imagining how best to respond to conflict and aggression. Whereas the widely used language of right to defense tends to reinforce armed strategies in instances of intergroup conflict, an emphasis on the right to life and the need for safety opens us to a new kind of frame in conflict transformation that encompasses the good of all the parties. Doing so also helps to lift up the notion of nonviolent civilian-based defense as another plausible strategy requiring consideration in such conflicts. Pope Francis explains, quote, especially in situations of conflict, let us respect this, our deepest dignity, and make active nonviolence our way of life, unquote. So to wrap up, unfortunately, the current war in Ukraine is another example in a long historical pattern of how the language and reasoning of just war can be used, distorted, and function politically to help enable the invasion and legitimate the ongoing war. Notably, Pope Francis proclaims, quote, there was a time, even in our churches, when people spoke of a holy war or a just war. Today, we cannot speak in this manner. A Christian awareness of the importance of peace has developed. With war, it is the people of God who pay. Our hearts cannot but weep before the children and women killed, along with all the victims of war. War is never the way. Peace be with you. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Eli. And we will pass it over to Wamuyu. Welcome.
Yes, so I chose to talk about transformative practice of a just peace ethic. Please let me know if I'm talking too fast. I'll try to be slow because also of my accent. Eli, you can go to the next slide. Yes, so that's the introduction of my sharing tonight. First, I want to look at concept of nonviolence. Is it utopia or call to a new way? Then aspects of nonviolence as an invitation. Then nonviolence as a way of being and doing. And I want to use an African perspective. I want to share my personal and also from cases of Kenya. Then call to a just peace. And I'll be looking at it from the merging of traditional and new, looking at the digital and the metaverse. And then we'll have questions, comments, or suggestions. Next slide, please. So, nonviolence as utopia or a call to new way. From where I sit, it is a new way of being and doing. It means that we have to wear new lenses as we look at the world, asking ourselves from the glasses or the lenses we are wearing, how does the world look like? Because for us to practice a just peace ethic, then we need to understand the world in which we live. Therefore, we need to see, to judge, and to act to the new needs of the world. And I would like to invite us to look at Jesus and the feeding of the 5,000. We are told Jesus looks at the crowd and something happens within his heart. A transformation begins to happen in his heart. And he judges the situation and doesn't do nothing about it. He asks the apostles, his disciples, to do something about it. but they are not ready because they are not at the same framework of mind. So they say, no, the easiest way, send them away. Let them go and look for something to eat themselves. But Jesus acts by saying, no, you give them something to eat. And it's only then that the loaves and the fish multiply. So therefore, we are being invited to a new way of looking, a new way of analyzing or judging, and then a new way of acting in response to the needs of our world. So I'm going to give examples of living out the just peace ethics. Next slide. So I am going to talk about my own experience of non-living in an African context. And I'm going to give from my own upbringing. In the African community, and I don't want to generalize, but there are certain practices that are common. The issue of community living, children learning through oral traditions. I'm talking now of a traditional African setting that most of our parents, even though they are modern, they still carry the traditions, the good aspects of our traditions. So in my upbringing, I was taught about honesty, about peace, about justice, by listening to stories from my grandmother. She used to tell us the story of the hare and other animals, the stories of monkeys stealing honey and then getting caught, the stories of the ogre that was deceitful, like it would lead people astray and then eat them up. And the morals of these stories were the positives. We were encouraged to live those positive aspects. The aspects that were not positive, from listening to what happened to those animals that were not good, that were deceitful, that were not peaceful, they were unjust, is a punishment that came with it, or something would happen to them that wasn't good. So from that, I learned the values, the just peace ethics values. And also through the song, through the poetry, through the myths, the legends, the wise sayings, and also dance. And also learning how to love. We were taught through how we related with each other. And I think this is common to families, about how children are taught in their families to love, to care. I remember my mother, we were 13, but now we are 12. And my mother would serve the food for all of us in little bowls. And we would be standing, waiting for the turn to eat. And of course, you'll be watching which one has more food. But at the end of the day, you had to eat what was next to you. So, and you'd be saying, no, I want that one. And you'd be told no, just as you'd like that particular bowl with more food. Your siblings also would need the same. So I learned justice and care and love. We were also taught respect for life. by caring and feeding the younger siblings, by taking care of animals such as cattle, cats, and dogs, feeding them. Of course, it wasn't very pleasant, but we were learning new things, that we are not the only ones in the world. There are other creatures. Respect and care of the elderly. Every Saturday, we had to go to an elderly home. I mean, not home in the modern concept, but we'd visit an old person in their house, cook for them, clean their house, and if need be, clean them up. So respect and care of the elderly. And then sharing with the poor. The poor would come home and would have to share what was there, which meant you ate less because you had to share. And then compassion and fairness. Why am I sharing this? It's because these values do not happen in a vacuum. They are values that a child is taught, and not so much through what they are taught, but by catching from the example of the parents or examples of the society. Next slide, please. So now I want to look at, that's my own experience, but now I want to look at the experience of a community in Kenya at the north part of Kenya. There are many different communities there. And that is the part where a lot of people suffer from famine and drought. When you hear there's famine, there's drought, people are dying of hunger, this is one of the places that suffers that. This is also one of the places that cattle rustling or cattle raiding, using guns, small weapons and mainly light weapons, the communities steal cattle from each other. And in the process, of course, mostly young people die. Women in this particular area carry small arms and light weapons, because they have to protect themselves, because some of them, their husbands go to fight. However, this same community is beginning to understand the value of peace. And I want to talk about this particular community in reference to women and how women are living non-violently. They have chosen to live that way. And I'm just going to pick a few of some of the ways, the non-violent ways they are using. There are many, but I just pick a few because of the time. Next slide, please. Now, I'm looking at the non-violent indigenous approaches within the community. One of them is the word of mouth. A mother's warning not to go to war is taken seriously, because motherhood, as in any society, and especially in Kenya, is treated with a lot of sacredness. So if a mother says, don't go to war, the son or even the husband will not do it, because there is belief that they will experience a curse or something bad will happen, so they will not go. So that's one of the ways that the women are using to stop wars. The other one is rituals, the cleansing after war. If the men decide to go to war, the woman is one who receives him back. So he cannot come to the house unless he's cleansed. And if he doesn't want to be cleansed, is the woman who is going to say that the husband has refused to be cleansed and he will not be allowed in the house. Why is the cleansing important? Because there is a belief that even if the man did not kill at war, the fact that he saw somebody being killed or was in that environment, it makes that person unclean and is carrying blood in their hands. So to discourage wars, then they'll have to go through the rituals. And some of them don't want to go through those rituals. So they may be discouraged from going to fight. The other one is the use of the body. And this is a culture, most of the African culture, that the mothers, if the mother undresses, then that calls for a curse. And usually the mother will only undress and show her nakedness if something is so serious. So they use this to tell the child, don't go to war, don't do this, otherwise I'm going to undress. And that, for any son to see the nakedness of the mother, then they will not want to do that. So they are discouraged from doing that. The other one is spilling of the milk from her breast. What she's trying to point out to the son is that I fed you from my breast. So if you really respect me, then do not go. Because if they do go to war, it's believed that they will not come back. And so normally that will deter the young people from going to war. So these are indigenous approaches. Next, sorry. The other one is that belt you are seeing the woman wear. Now, this belt is not like that. Traditionally, it doesn't. This is a modern belt. However, it kind of portrays what I want to talk about. That belt is a birth belt. It's called legetio or legetiet from that particular community. It's a very special belt, and you can see it as, if you look at it near, when you are near, you'll see cowrie shells and it's decorated, it's beautiful. The woman wears it when, especially when she gives birth, to bring back the womb into shape. It can also be used for birth control, because so long as the woman is wearing it, the man cannot go near her. The man cannot touch her. It is also used to prevent violence, gender violence against women, because so long as the woman wears it, the man cannot touch her. So if a man is violent and wants to beat his wife, he cannot once she's wearing it. It's also a belt that is used to bless the young people or the men when they are going to war. If she's wearing it, then it's believed that when men go to war, they will come back safe. However, nowadays, women are using it to do the opposite. They refuse to wear, so that to discourage the men from going to war. So they will not wear the belt, and the man cannot touch it, so they cannot force them to wear. If there are two parties fighting, and one party is pursuing the other for a fight, the woman will remove that belt and put it on the ground, and the other party cannot jump over it. So to stop the war. So it's a very special belt, and it's being used currently to deal with the violence in the North Rift, where there's a lot of violence in that particular area. So that's a very special belt. And it's different. There's one for the girls and there's another for the woman. So one would have to understand how many, one has 2 lines, others are 3 lines. I'm not from that culture, but I'm researching more on it because there's more to it. So I'm doing a research at the moment about it because I believe that the African wars may be addressed through these indigenous practices that were there. And we may need to borrow from the African culture, especially to deal with those wars in Africa, which are intractable, unfortunately. So, and there are many others. These are just some of them because of time. Next, please. So that drawing there is my own creation. And this is an approach I was offering when I did my PhD. It's a cultural approach to violence. My research was on youth violence. So I was using this as one way of dealing with violence, using virtues. Now, you see the experiences, the importance of experiences, because the narrations or the narratives of a society is passed on to generations to come. The importance of passing values from one generation to another. And this in the African culture was done, you know, for example, the birth, when children are born, there is celebration. There is celebration when they are born, when they are being named. In my own culture, when they are 12 years old, there was some marks which would be put in the ears to decorate them, to mark the different stages. And even death is celebrated as moving from one life to another, to the ancestors, to the living dead, and so on. Even the violent conflicts, people are reminded so that they know, yes, this violent happened, let it not happen again. So the importance of experiences in order to pass virtues and the values to children from one generation to another. The other one is the importance of worldviews. How do we pass meaning, the meanings in a particular community? How do we transmit that? Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? That's a philosophical question. But in the African culture, it was very, very important about transmitting meaning for children to understand who they are, where they came from, where they are going, why they have a particular name, what that name means. It's like you are living through the person. So it continues. The worldviews are formed, and values have to do with the worldviews. How do we see the world? We can only see the world depending on the eyes that we have built. And the eyes are not just eyes, the physical eyes, it's the heart and the whole person. Then the importance of attitudes, which are acquired through experiences and cultural values. So these cultural values, once they are embraced, they're incorporated in a person, in the society, then they are passed on. And that's why for us, the whole idea of ancestors and the living dead when people die, because we don't believe people don't die, they born from one life, they become ancestors. After some years, they become the living dead. So wherever there are ceremonies, we invoke them because they are alive. Their values if there are bad people, then you are reminded not to copy those values. The children are not named after people who had issues, whose values were not okay. The children are not given those names in case the lives that were not meaningful are passed on to the children. Next, please. So remember when I talked at the beginning, is how then do we bring these traditions that I'm talking about and merge them with the new generation? Because they have to merge. We cannot work in isolation. So how do we embrace the digital world without losing the earth, our common home? Because we have this other world. How do we embrace the two? One way is to invite the children and young people to create a virtual space of peace. Because that's the way. We cannot force them to leave the traditions, but we can embrace the new by them creating those spaces. It is about merging the elderly and of the youth, as the Pope pointed out in his encyclical. And then watching that the children or the young people are not replacing human love with the digital about the just peace ethics. Our children these days are becoming friends of the mobile phones. So the mobile phones have become their friends. They speak to them. While they are doing everything, they have them. So how do we bring them to realize that you cannot replace human love with gadgets? Next slide, please. So then how do we get the new lenses to move to the 21st century? I'm recommending that we merge the two. We pick what is of old and the new, and we merge and get a new way. Walking the path of our ancestors, that is respecting our people's history. We respect our history. We cannot move forward unless we know where we are coming from. And then living the present and building a new culture of peace. And then how do we do this? This is I'm moving towards the end. Next slide, please. So how do we then live values? It means we speak and live the just peace value. Speaking and living them is to cry with the poor. That is compassion. To love and work for justice. That is to speak the truth and act in and for the truth. To walk humbly with God. That is to shed pride of wealth, of exploitation, of abuse, of dictatorship, of corruption in all its forms. To detest and condemn all forms of violence through deconstruction of violent structures and cultures in our local and global context. Next, please. So in conclusion, we are being challenged to walk the path of gospel and violence, to live out a just peace ethics means we embrace the virtues of love for all, even the people we refer to as our enemies. To engage in community sharing, in compassion, in respect for all. Forgiveness, to understand the meaning of forgiveness and live it. To understand harmony and how harmony plays out in communities. Justice, peace, tolerance, and mercy. And we have people who were flesh like us. We have Martin Luther King, Romero, Mahatma Gandhi, Wangari Maathai from my country, Desmond Tutu, and all of us have examples. And for me, I have my two parents who passed on last year, whom for me were epitome of peace and justice. But the greatest example in our history is Jesus of Nazareth, born of Mary, who came to this earth that all may have life and have it more abundantly. The last slide, please. So that's my other side. You see, my message there is non-violent living starts from the heart. So let us teach our hearts to love, speak, and act non-violently. Thank you. Asante sana.